One of the most important stories in human history is the creation story of the Hebrew Bible. Its impact can still be felt today in debates over the proper role of creation and evolution in American classrooms. Today's guest is a respected scientist whose published work seeks common ground between God and science. He's Kenneth Miller, this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Every week we sit down with storytellers and scholars to make sense of the power of narrative in American public life. This week we're joined by Kenneth R. Miller, who is professor of biology at Brown University, and he's also led pioneering research on cell membranes and structures, but he's also an author who has sought to reconcile faith and reason. Kenneth, thank you so much for being with us. Your new book, The Human Instinct, How We Evolved and Have Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will, congratulations, it's a wonderful piece of work.
Thank you.
You begin the book, though, with two simple but elegant sentences. You write, "Stories matter, and once we had one." What was that story?
Well, the story was how we arose. And in every single culture in the world, there is an origin story of some sort. In Western culture, we're familiar with the Adam and Eve story, but it's certainly not the only one. In the legends of the Navajo, it's when first man and first woman moved from the third world into the fourth. In the stories of the Hopi, it's the origination on the sacred mesas of the Hopi. And these origin stories serve a purpose in every culture. And they serve a purpose in terms of explaining the relationship between human beings and the natural world, our duties to each other, and ultimately the meaning and purpose and value of human life. And for thousands of years, Western culture in particular, broadly construed, was drawn around the Adam and Eve origin story. It fixed us on the earth. It gave us the responsibility to care for creation. And it explained who we were and how we were different from the animals. And then that second sentence is, and then we lost it.
Yeah, so how did we lose it, and what replaced it, if anything?
Well, we lost it over a long time, and it was the work of many writers and thinkers and scientists. But it's easiest to say it was Charles Darwin's fault.
Blame Darwin.
There you go. And the cultural reaction, first to The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and then 9 years later to his second really great book, The Descent of Man, was noticeable. There is an old, probably apocryphal story of the reaction of the English gentry to The Origin of Species, and the quote goes something like this. Having read the book, a person said, "Let us hope it is not true, but if it is true, let us hope that it does not become generally known." Because the idea is that placing human origins not in heaven, but in the most mundane elements of reproduction, of struggle for survival and natural selection, would not only dethrone human beings from our special place, but would also change our self-image to the point where culture and society would become nasty and brutish, and basically would break down the culture that had developed to that point, and so, that's the concern.
So you know, with a 21st century mindset, that sometimes seems, and this is my own personal bias, you know, educated in the great books of Western civilization, I think it's maybe difficult for a modern ear or modern mind to understand the disruption that Darwin's theories had on people's understanding of their world in the universe. Is that?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you slightly. Okay. And the reason for that is almost alone among advanced industrialized countries. In the United States, fully 50% of the population will reject the theory of evolution.
That's true even today.
And that is true even today. Now, according to the most recent Gallup polls, that number has begun to dwindle. And it's now down to only about 37% of the population who would argue that human beings originated in pretty much their present form about 10,000 years ago. That's the Gallup poll question. But if you talk to such people, if you speak at the campuses of religious universities where such views are quite prevalent, what they will tell you is the problem with the theory of evolution is that it demeans human beings. It tells us that we are just animals. And as many people have told me, if you tell people they're just animals, then we will behave like animals. And that is the danger to culture. In addition to the overt danger of basically of dethroning the book of Genesis as a literal book of history and science.
And this led in this country to a number of laws being implemented in terms of teaching of evolution or not teaching, and teaching of creationism or not. So it became a legal issue in this country as well, and that has roots that date to the 19th century, I'm assuming.
Well, actually, the laws almost uniformly were passed in the early 20th century. And the most famous of these in the state of Tennessee was the Butler Act. And the Butler Act forbade the teaching of any theory that denied the divine origin of human beings. It is the Butler Act under which John Scopes, Tennessee biology teacher, was prosecuted in the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And interestingly, people tend to forget because when they think about the Scopes trial, they think about the fictionalized Inherit the Wind version.
Spencer Tracy.
It's a great
wonderful movie.
It's a great movie, but it doesn't conform to history.
Right.
And it doesn't conform to history in a number of ways, which we could go into. But it's important to remember that John Scopes was convicted. The conviction was set aside, but was not reversed. And it was set aside on the technicality that he'd been fined $100. And Tennessee law required any fines in excess of $50 to be imposed by a jury. And since it was a bench trial, he didn't have to pay the fine. But the conviction stood. And the Butler Act remained on the books in Tennessee, and there were similar laws in 5 other states until 1968. Now, I actually graduated from high school in 1966, which will not only tell you how old I am, but will tell you that at the time I was growing up, the teaching of evolution was actually illegal in 6 American states.
So, in your new book, you take quite a different tack. And I'm going to read a passage, a very brief passage from the preface for 2 reasons. One, because the language is so beautiful. And I want to ask you later how a scientist gets to write so beautifully. And the second, and hopefully you'll have a good answer for us. And the second reason I want to read it is this really is the grand theme of your book. And so, to quote, "We are the children of evolution in every sense, but we are children of the universe as well. And from that realization comes a new and exhilarating way to see our place among other living things and our home among the stars." Talk about that. That is really the theme of your book.
Yes, it's very much the theme. I'm going to defer on your compliments, although I appreciate them.
Well, they were heartfelt and sincere.
And I do appreciate that. And what I would say is that in high school and even in college, I had teachers who inspired me and believed in me and emphasized the importance of language. And I realized early on in my scientific career that the ability to communicate was central to the mission of a scientist, both as a researcher and a teacher. The ability to write clearly, it comes across in such mundane ways as a grant proposal. And I can tell you, I've had grant proposals submitted and turned down, as all scientists have, but often turned down with compliments by saying, well, we don't think this should be funded, but boy, is it beautifully written. That doesn't get you any funding. Unfortunately, I've been able to secure funding for my research in many different ways, including competitive grant proposals. But that's part of the essential skill, and the ability to use language is also part of teaching. And I've been a university educator for 44 years, and that ability to communicate, as any teacher will tell you, is part and parcel of it. The sentence you read does crystallize the message in my book, and the message is this. And that is, we are creatures of evolution in every sense. We are animals, there's no question about that. We have our origins in the same process of evolution that produced every other living thing on this earth. But from that, I think there is, as I said, an exhilarating way to look at ourselves. And I take inspiration from the late Carl Sagan, who pointed out that we are creatures of matter. That is true. We are literally, and Sagan loved to say this, we are literally made of stardust because the heavier elements of which our bodies are composed were actually forged in the fires of stars. And that's what makes us up. That is what makes life possible. But the interesting thing about that, and this is what excited Sagan, is that we are the part of the cosmos that has become not only alive, but intelligent and self-aware. So human existence on this planet is the beginning of the cosmos waking up and beginning to contemplate itself. And I regard that as our fundamental mission as human beings.
Profound.
Is that so? You know, you said something already that I want to just sort of play with a little bit. The idea that the theory of evolution essentially diminishes humanity. It denies our divine origins. It makes us less. This is not you don't approach this from a theological perspective or a philosophical perspective, but that quote from Carl Sagan is spiritual without necessary reference to God. How do you reconcile the sort of the religious implications of evolution with sort of people's need to believe and sincere and faithful adherence to a religion?
Well, let me start out by responding to the very first thing you said. I don't think the theory of evolution or our evolutionary origins as human beings diminish us in any way.
Okay.
I think they define us as sort of the conscious, self-aware organisms that we are able, we're the only organisms on this planet who are able to understand the process that brought us and other living things about. That alone is a special achievement, but it's also a special responsibility. In terms of the issue of religion, in writing this book, I wanted to write a book that basically would appeal to the secular mind in terms of understanding the importance of human existence and the significance of our species without making a direct appeal to religious faith. Now, as a matter of record, I'm a practicing Roman Catholic, and my very first trade book, my book for public consumption, was entitled Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. And in that book, I started out by completely defending every aspect of the theory of evolution, and then by explaining how a religious person could understand evolution as being the working out of God's plan. Now, the interesting thing about that, from my point of view, is although I'm not a biblical literalist, most Catholics are not, I would turn to Scripture, and I would point out that Genesis said that man was fashioned out of the dust of the earth. And there's an admonition, which the priest says as he rubs ashes on your forehead on Ash Wednesday. Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. I can't think of any more profound statement about the material nature of human existence than those two scriptural passages. And all that modern science says is indeed, we really are fashioned out of the material of the earth. That shouldn't come as a surprise to any religious person, and therefore it should not come as a surprise that we have our origins in a, frankly, material process like evolution.
So what was the reaction to Finding Darwin's God from within the Roman Catholic Church and from other faiths as well, if you can sort of summarize that?
Well, writing that book, which appeared in, I think, 1999, was an interesting exercise for me, because to my fellows in the scientific community, you might say I came out of the closet as a Christian, because all of my
big time out of the closet.
Yeah, because all of my writings up to that point have been purely scientific,
and nobody knew what faith you practiced. Or,
yeah, but that, again, that's not relevant in science.
Yeah.
I mean, I can collaborate with someone who is a Buddhist or someone who is a Muslim or someone who's an atheist or an agnostic, and we never asked that question. We simply asked, what's the DNA sequence that you have? What's the size of the protein? Where were the bands on the gel? Science is the closest thing we have on this planet to a universal culture, and that's what makes science work. Science is not anti-religious as many people think, it's non-religious, and I think that's appropriate. Now, in terms of reaction, there is a perception that scientists and the scientific community are hostile to people of faith. And sometimes I've been asked, woo, when you wrote that book, you know, what happened at the next scientific meeting? Did people do this to you? Did they shun you and so forth? And the answer is no, not at all. And I remember going to both the cell biology and the Biochemistry Society meetings the year after the book came out, and it did get a bit of a splash of publicity. And I had people coming up to me and saying, you wrote that book, didn't you? And I said, yes. And they said, well, I'm not a Christian, or I'm not a person of faith. But I read the book, and I really appreciate the fact that you wrote a book urging people of faith, religious people, to accept science for what it is. Because in a society like ours in the United States, and we continue to be the leading scientific nation in the world, but in such a nation where so many people are indeed religious, it's very important to cultivate support for science among the faith community. And they were happy that my book did exactly that. Now, as for the reaction of the church, sometimes I've been asked, what does the pastor at my local church think of me? And at the time the book came out, I had a quick answer to that, and that was the only thing the pastor of Mount Carmel Church in Seekonk knew about me at the time was that I was coaching the girls' CYO basketball team. And that was the extent of it. But in terms of the reaction within the Catholic Church, I've actually been given an embarrassingly large number of awards from Catholic colleges and universities, been invited to speak at every university in the United States with Loyola in its name. And
that's a good record.
And actually regarded, at least by some people, as an example of how a scientist can be a person of faith. And I'm very quick to say, listen, I'm not unique. The founder of the modern science of genetics, Father Gregor Mendel, was in fact an Augustinian priest. The mathematician who first worked out the mathematics of cosmic expansion, the theoretical basis of what we call the Big Bang, was in fact Father Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest and a professor of physics and mathematics. So a tradition of scientific inquiry within the church is actually a very long-standing tradition, the Galileo affair notwithstanding.
All right. Do you have a, so I'm curious, what propelled you in your first book to not write about cell structures or cell membranes? What led you to this series of publications?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I am a cell biologist, and my primary research focus has been on biological membranes, which are marvelous things. I can tell you all about them. And specifically the photosynthetic membrane, upon which all animal life depends. This is the structure that captures the energy of sunlight and converts it not only into the food we eat, but also into the oxygen we breathe. And most of my research has been centered on that. But here's the real story. And that is, in my very first year at Brown, I was approached by a group of students who thought I was an effective lecturer in the classroom. They thought I was a good public speaker. And I was challenged to debate the country's foremost so-called scientific creationist and leading critic of evolution, a gentleman named Henry Morris, who had founded the Institution for Creation Research in California and was a denier of evolution, arguing the Earth is just 6,000 years old, the Adam and Eve story is true, and all this other sort of stuff. And after some deliberation, I took up the challenge. And I said, yes, I will debate this guy. But you have to get me his books, articles. I need to know where he's coming from. And when they provided me with these, I realized that I really didn't know enough about evolution to debate him. So I was in the process of setting up my laboratories, my first year at Brown, and I literally dropped everything for about 6 weeks, and I researched every one of these arguments. I called up other scientists I knew. I tried to read basic books on evolutionary theory, and then I prepared, in effect, a slideshow ready to rebut every one of these points and to defend evolution. Now, this is hard to believe in today's context. The students were selling tickets to this event because they had some expenses to defray. When they sold over 200 tickets, they had to move it from a classroom to a lecture hall. When they sold over 500, they had to move it to an auditorium. And when they sold over 1,000, they had to move it, and this is true, to the largest room on our campus, which is the ice hockey rink.
There's something poetic justice
I
in
think there is. I think there is. Although the ice was up, the debate took place in April. And I debated Henry Morris for several hours in front of more than 2,000 people. This event is documented in the Annals of the Providence Journal, so you can see that it's authentic. And I came away from that with two things that really made an impression on me. Well, maybe three. The first one was, my God, what have I gotten myself into? The second one was how intense this issue was for so many people, because this crowd of over 2,000 came from all over the greater Providence area. There were church groups, there were secular groups, there were my own students at Brown, everyone else. And the passion was absolutely unbelievable. I could have won the Nobel Prize for my work, and I could not possibly have drawn a crowd that large. And that told me about the intensity of this. And then the final point was when I realized that so many hundreds or thousands of people were there hoping to see the central idea, the central organizing principle of the biological sciences refuted. That's when I realized, my God, it's so important to stand up for science in our society. Because basically, if the American people basically develop an idea that the basic principles upon which scientific research is founded, this is certainly true in the life sciences, are in fact flawed and bogus, that'll change the support for science in our society. And in a democracy, the American scientific enterprise, frankly, depends upon public support. And that energized my determination to continue to try to do what I could to dispel these misconceptions and to generate public support for science.
So there were other national debates on this issue, and then about 10 years later, you co-authored with Joseph Levine the first of your college and high school biology texts, which have gone on to be used by millions of students. But that was not without controversy either. Tell us about that. The creationists, or the people who did not believe in evolution, which was in that textbook of yours, didn't like it. What happened?
Well, I was talked into writing a high school biology textbook by a former student of mine named Joe Levine. And Joe and I made each other a promise, and that was in the interest of marketing or publicity, we would never do anything. We would never write anything in our book or allow anything to be taken out that would embarrass us among our scientific colleagues. We wanted to write a scientifically accurate and comprehensive book. When you do that about biology, evolution comes out as the central organizing principle in all of biology. So the central unit of the book is in fact a whole unit on evolution, but evolution is not confined to a few chapters or even a unit. Evolution permeates the textbook, and as it does all of biology. And critics of evolution very quickly realized that is indeed the case. And this led to organized movements in several school districts around the country to knock our book off an approved list. This happened several times, for example, during the public adoption procedures in the state of Texas. In one county in Georgia, Cobb County, which is a major suburban area north of Atlanta, it even led the local school board to put a warning sticker on the front of our book, telling students that evolution is just a theory, it's a matter of controversy, you should study it carefully and critically consider it. That actually led to a lawsuit in federal district court in Atlanta, a First Amendment lawsuit by people who saw those stickers as an attempt to promote a particular religious point of view and using the public schools to do it. And I ended up testifying in that trial. And about a year later, a school board in Dover, Pennsylvania, decided that they would basically substitute or supplement evolution with a curriculum of a religiously inspired anti-evolution idea called intelligent design. And I ended up being the lead witness in that trial as well. So it's fair to say that my textbook has gotten me in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, we've got about. I think you might like that trouble, though.
Good trouble.
We've got about a minute and a half left here, and this is way too big a question to possibly grapple with that in that time. But let's see what we can do. You're describing this sort of critical tension that's spread across the country around the issue of evolution. But I'm wondering your thoughts on just the level of science literacy in the United States today.
Well, one of the things that may surprise some people is that by objective standards, by quizzes and tests, what do you know, the level of scientific literacy among adults in the United States is actually slightly higher than it is in most Western European countries. And part of that may be simply because we have many high-tech industries in which a knowledge of basic science is actually very important. It's also true, however, that certain areas of science have become highly politicized. And it's not just evolution, it's also climate change, it's vaccines against disease, and in many respects, the problem with public acceptance of science in the United States is more of a cultural problem than it is a problem, I think, of just flat-out scientific ignorance.
What do you mean by a cultural problem?
A cultural problem in the sense of a tendency on the part of many people and even organized political parties, not to name any of those parties, to see scientists as leftist, collectivist, and elitist, who basically have a political and social agenda to foist on the rest of us rather than purely being interested in science for its own sake.
It's a remarkable conversation, and the book, The Human Instinct, is really something. Kenneth, thank you so much for being with us. He's Kenneth R. Miller. The book is The Human Instinct. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can visit us at pellcenter.org, where you can also catch up on previous episodes. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.